It's just for the recording here. Yeah, yeah, it's not the microphone too.
That suggests
Just for here.
yeah, how long have I got for the actual? Yeah, it's probably going to be less. I'd like the discussion to take over a little bit more maybe, but we'll see how it goes. Great.
So hello everybody. I'm really happy to welcome Giovanni Aloi. So Giovanni just published a book about art and animal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have
Yes,
it?
it's a very interesting book. It's part of a series of books published by Editors, and it's meant to be somewhat of an introduction to the subject of animals in contemporary art, especially. I don't know how many of you are very interested in this subject, but there has been quite a lot published in the way of animals in contemporary thinking, more in general, over the past 15 years. And I thought I'll give my contribution to the contemporary art spectrum. So the book is very much an overview of what's happened over the past 15 to 20 years in contemporary art, how the animal has changed from object to subject to collaborator to anything that's not symbolism in a way, even if that's a very complicated place to go. And it's a strange kind of jumping from one work to another, trying to summarize the big issues that the animal presents in contemporary thinking and art. And France's work is discussed in the book, and so is Eduardo, very essential artists on the panorama of animals in contemporary art.
So you are also the founder and the editor-in-chief of the online journal Antenna.
Oh yes, that's that one too. Yeah.
I really encourage you to go online and see this journal. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Really nice interview. You also studying. You are also researching on your PhD.
Yeah.
Also the subject art and.
That's specifically on taxidermy in contemporary art. I'm very fascinated by objects, you know, in a world of contemporary art that seems to be completely uninterested in objects as such. I'm very much interested in this idea of the animal becoming object and this idea of surfaces as well. I don't want to give too much away. But taxidermy is definitely returned to haunt us forever. Probably not going away anytime soon.
And you have a background in curating.
Yeah,
Fine art.
quite a lot of fine art and criticism in general, and I also teach for quite a few places in London, like Roehampton University, Queen Mary University, the Open University, and I work for Tate, which is quite exciting place. There's a Damien Hirst exhibition on right now, which you might have thoughts and questions about later on. His use of animals is of course very controversial. But nevertheless, there might be something there that goes beyond just the scandal kind of thing. So yeah, if you guys, thank you, Franz. Yes, let's start. Do you want to come and take a seat at the front so that we make good use of chairs? They like to be used for the purpose they were designed for. And it's nice to see we almost have no chairs to spare. Now, first of all, I actually thought this through as a kind of discussion-based opportunity. I just wanted to talk, and I wanted to hear you talking too. I just didn't want to be the one that goes blah 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 for over an hour. And before I start, reading from my paper, I just wanted to ask generally, what's the level of knowledge of what's going on with the animal in contemporary culture, so that we're all on the same page, more or less. Have we followed what's been happening? Completely unaware? Let's have a few hands up. Completely unaware. 3. Okay. So I'm assuming that the rest is rather knowledgeable. Let's do the opposite. Extremely knowledgeable. 2. Okay, well that gives me a good idea. So, first of all, what I'm trying to do today is actually to pose a question that's very dear to me, and that I think it's very essential to the idea of what the animal does in culture, more in general, contemporary culture, especially in art. And this question is related to the animal as what's very difficult to actually qualify. So for those of you who have read some philosophical texts about reality, hyperreality, and more in general about phenomenology, the question really is what is real and what isn't in some respect. And with the animal, part of the issue is further complicated by the idea that we have this thing called the live animal, right, which we all agree it's that being that functions biologically in similar ways to us, and sometimes in not so similar ways. You think about metamorphosis in insects, that's pretty far-fetched. I've tried for years to cocoon myself and come out as a butterfly, didn't work. Very messy business in the process. But we have that thing, which is the real animal that is alive, and I'm already falling into it. I've called it the real animal. But then again, there is the animal that exists in a representational world. There is the animal that is alive, if you like, in paintings, literature, philosophy. Is that real, or is it not real? And it all depends, we don't want to get into anything to do with distinguishing the real from the non-real, anything to do with Nietzsche right now, especially. But the point really is that the animal that populates representation and, philosophy, history, art, literature, is an agent as much as agency, as much as the live animal does, in the way that we relate to the live animal in response to the representation that the animal has been given. Does that make sense? So, for example, a lion. It's a very basic example. Lion in the wild does certain things of which we only know few aspects. But if you look at culture, Western culture, painting most especially, as soon as you see a lion in a painting, some ideas are immediately associated with that presence. So the lion signifies usually bravery, values that have got very little to do with the animal itself. Courage, strength. But the lion can't conceive any of these, right? We have constructed this lion identity around the animal based on the existence of the biologically active lion, the one that breathes and runs and does things. The lion doesn't think much of bravery, right? That's a concept we've created and we've attached to the lion so that it makes it easier for us to capture. Now that process affects our relationship with animals in a great way. Think about mice. Do you like mice? Yeah? Mice you invite in the house? As pets or mice that come in whenever they want? Which one do you like more? It's a tricky one, right?
Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse. You see, that's how it works. We like Mickey Mouse. How often does Mickey Mouse come knocking on your door? Not very often, right? So the one that comes in of its own will, it's not usually very welcome. It looks very different as well. But there's mouse and there's mouse. Does that make sense? And that's a big discrepancy there. The mouse that comes in unexpectedly, it's a pest. And what do you do to pests? Kill them. That's it. No hesitation. Really, you do kill them. Nobody likes to say that, but we do kill them. Unless you really like to share your house with 100 mice. They multiply pretty quickly, which is not a nice feature for us. It's good for them. So this idea again of representation, when did we decide that mice were pests? A long time ago. It's got to do with space, it's got to do with our space and their space. Is there a way we could share our space with them? I don't want to know if you do, right? That's fine. Nevertheless, representational mice, Mickey Mouse, lovely, get it in all the time. Real mouse, not so much. What went wrong? Have you looked at the difference in the representation of Mickey Mouse and the real mouse? They're very different things. Representation has worked so hard on changing that mouse, the real, let's call it real, the animal that breathes and runs and does things, to something else, that they are not reconcilable. So you look at Mickey Mouse, it's like, oh cute, I want to see 2 hours of Mickey Mouse dancing and singing and doing all these things. If I give you a mouse that it's alive, 2 hours here doing things, you wouldn't like that, right? You're like, oh, how interesting. So representation works in very, very different ways, and it's very difficult to kind of summarize now what it does, but it can create images of animals that have got nothing at all to do with the animal itself. And it can create images of animals that end up being overlap to the animal, the one that is alive, the one that functions in the biological world. Nevertheless, you can see that Mickey Mouse is very much alive in our minds, right? It does things. It does things in our minds. In our minds, Mickey Mouse does exist and can be used. Have you seen, like, for example, when you get the Thanksgiving parade, right? Then you get a massive Mickey Mouse walking around. Is that real? Kinda. It's walking around, it's out there. It's not alive like the real mouse or the biologically functioning mouse, but it does things. You see that big mouse and you smile, and he summons a whole range of meanings, a whole range of ideas. So it is an agent, it functions in different ways from the actual animal that functions in a biological way. So my question really is about, in art, literature, philosophy today, how important is it that in order to discuss or understand the animal and our relationship to the animal, we relate to the biologically active animal? So, for example, if I were to write about the mouse in philosophy, an interesting book, does it matter that I spend time with mice, like the biologically active mice? Or do I just go straight into the library and look for all sorts of representations of mice? You see the importance of the question? Do you go searching for the live animal? And in that case, how do you derive knowledge from the live animal to feed your inquiry on the mouse and our relationship of the mouse? Is it essential that you do so? Do you work from secondary sources and just look at texts where mice infiltrate? You just look at paintings in which there is a mouse and try to understand how it works. There is something quite important at the bottom of this question, which is the subject of what we deal with when we engage with the animal is alive. You notice that? Not all subjects you will engage with in your artistic practice are alive. Is anyone engaging with alive things? Yay! Lindsay, plants, right? Anybody else?
People.
People, wow. That's really setting the bar quite high. So again, the same question can kind of apply to respect. Are they alive? Good, that's reassuring. So technically, there is a question there in whether for the creation of work and for the reasoning around the subject, there is any relevance there in going back to the original alive subject or not, and what difference does that cause to your work? When it comes to animals more specifically, we want to get into people right away, neither plants in that respect. The issue is that some philosophers have gone at length, have kind of like taken liberties to talk about animals and sort of create skewed perspectives on what the animal may be doing or may not be doing based on the fact that they actually have not looked at the animal. Make sense? And we'll see what that creates. So what I'm really doing is posing a question to you. That's why I'd like to hear quite a lot of perspectives and have discussion after this to see what your ideas are. Because I haven't really reached a conclusion myself. I'm sure that you can pitch this at different levels and at different, it can be very important to some to actually refer back to the live animal, and it might be completely irrelevant to others, but I think there's an ethical question there when talking about something that is alive or that is at danger of not being alive for very long, that some considerations are drawn. So, does that make any sense? You sure it does? Okay, I trust you on that one. So, in 2004, while looking for a comprehensive and reliable text on the methodologies of artistic analysis, something for students to use as a reference text, I encountered the book, The Methodologies of Art, an Introduction by Laurie Schneider-Adams. Do you know the book? No? The book looks like this. Yeah, some of you know the book. Good. So, there's a very interesting section in the introduction of this book. First published in 1996, the book has since become a classic of its kind. Towards the beginning, in a chapter ambitiously titled, What is Art?, Adams initiates a discussion of the artistic impulse, and in the attempt to answer such question in just over 10 pages, the author ends up defining art as what separates the human from the non-human. This is a quote from the book. Animals build only in nature, and their buildings are determined by nature. This includes birds' nests, beehives, ant hills, and beaver dams. Mollusks, from the lowliest snail to the complex chambered nautilus, build their houses around their own bodies and carry them wherever they go. Spiders weave webs and caterpillars spin cocoons, but such constructions are genetically programmed by the species that make them and do not express individual and cultural ideas. End quote. This passage, along with the rest of the author's argument, left me rather cold, for I found proclaiming the uniqueness of art as a human prerogative by comparison to the lack of abilities of animals rather hollow. The author supports the well-known case for human superiority over comparative inadequacy, and identifies art as the noble differentiating feature of the secular division between human and animal. It is a statement designed to stroke readers' egos, suggesting that their interest in something novel, like art, furthers their own nobility by implication. But if anything, from my perspective, this passage posits art as something smaller than I knew it to be. Nevertheless, the fact that such argument found a comfortable place at the beginning of a very popular book designed to introduce undergraduate students to a new subject, and therefore to shape their initial knowledge of it, troubled me to some degree. The animal doesn't do art, innuendo, gathers momentum through the chapter, as we are informed that spiders, like humans, this is another quote, are not inspired by aesthetics or narrative ideas. They neither observe the environment nor make a conscious choice to create the abstract geometry of their webs. An artist, on the other hand, Schneider says, might observe a spider's web and transform it into a work of art. End quote. What Adams worryingly fails to acknowledge is that the term art entails a complex system of negotiations that goes well beyond the creation of an object. However, if we consider creativity as the universal originator of all art, then we find that animals are surely capable of displaying that, at times in ways that indeed border on the understanding of the creative in humans. One example among the many is provided by the male vogelkop bowerbird. Have you ever seen a male vogelkop bowerbird in action? Yes. How many of you have? 2. How come? You encountered them or not?
Only videos. not-
Videos,
not
yeah.
real
Oh yeah,
life.
yeah.
Videos?
Yeah, video, yeah.
They're quite fascinating. We're going to watch a video together. And I'm going to explain also how I'm presenting these videos. It's not, it's quite complicated when we watch nature documentaries, wildlife documentaries, that there's a lot of filtering that goes through. So we shouldn't be looking at videos of animals doing things as if they were reality as such, whatever reality might be in that respect. So just to give you an idea, what the bowerbird does, that they use arches to support large barn-like structures. So they create quite a sizey nest that's actually built not as a container on the floor or set in branches like some birds do, but these birds are actually capable of building barn-like structures that they adorn with flowers, leaves, and other found objects in order to attract females. So we can only assume that the author there completely decided to overlook these birds because, of course, it's instrumental to her claim that birds or other animals do not display any aesthetic judgment or follow any aesthetic judgment in the building of what they do. So individuals of these species favor different color arrangements, which is quite fascinating. You'll see like birds choosing blue as their theme, and they stick to it. Or sometimes you'll see they choose other colors that are not quite as attractive. And females seem to pay keen attention to the quality of the ornamentation before settling with one partner. So it's a very important thing. It's not just about personal taste. So we have 3 videos to go through together. The first one is about the vogelkop bowerbirds, and then there's some spiders coming your way. We're going to watch them at different times. But first of all, just there was this case that seemed to me a little bit odd, bubbling up in the UK with David Attenborough. You all know David Attenborough, right? Big documentary expert who has created some of the most amazing works ever in the range of wildlife documentary. Now, recently, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago, there was this footage of polar bears that was featured in one of his most recent documentaries, which included some material filmed in a zoo in Berlin. Did you get any inkling over here? No, probably just the UK kind of strange frenzy. And suddenly was deemed to be disastrous that footage of the bears acting in their environment was mixed with footage of the mother bear in her nest taking care of newborn cubs. And I kind of found it really surprising. At what stage didn't you realize that that's actually the practice of wildlife documentaries? That when you see a butterfly hatching from a chrysalis in a wildlife documentary, do you think they've actually gone scavenging for these chrysalids and found them under leaves and then set the camera there for a few days waiting for that to hatch? No, it's done in a studio, man. It's pretty, but that doesn't take anything away from it. With that, if you want to see the process, well, that's the process in its best possible clarity, right? You want to see the chrysalis behind the black background so you can really appreciate it when the butterfly comes out with the best lighting. If you've ever tried, has anyone ever tried catching a butterfly coming out of a chrysalis in the wild or even in your back gardens? Well, try waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning because that's when they like doing it, first of all. And then tell me what the light conditions are like, and considering you can't move around that pole or brick that the chrysalis is attached to, what kind of documentary you're going to create? Well, not the standard that everyone expects from David Attenborough. He went on TV and explained he gave an interview where he explained that nobody could have filmed what was going on inside the nest, you know, the den, because the mother polar bear would have just gone mad at any intrusion. Even a camera, the smallest camera inserted into the den could have actually just triggered a reaction, which could have ended into the killing of the cubs and just abandoning everything. So why would you do that when you can use a zoo in Germany where a mother is going through just the same process and she's much more willing to cooperate because, you know, the setting she's in allows us to actually spy on her behavior in a different way. Of course, this raises a number of issues, right? And again, one of the issues is, okay, in that case, if everything is constructed, if wildlife documentaries are a construction whereby some of it happens in a studio and some of it is actually filmed on location, and then editing comes in, you're all aware of the power of editing, right? It's incredible what you can do once you reassemble a story. You can cut out anything you don't like, and you can make the story the way you really want it to be, regardless of whether that's really happened or not. So if you consider that wildlife documentaries are extremely constructed in what they show us, and that you can say, you know, your objectivity comes to play here, where you can say, well, I've tried as director and the editor and the team of like 25 people who work with me, see how many subjectivities are involved here? We've tried as close as possible to reproduce this event the way it happens in nature. Chances are it's not really quite the same, right? And again, does it matter? That really is the question. Can you experience nature personally, directly, in such a way that you can trust the knowledge that's being created by that phenomenon? Can you? Or do you refuse to access anything that's not presented to you in that direct way? So you say, oh, well, I'd rather not watch. Some people have done so. They said, well, what's the point in watching wildlife documentaries if we know that they're all constructed? I said, well, what do you do then? Learn nothing about nature because you've just realized that there's a man with a camera filming these things and it wasn't somebody's eye? So there's a number of issues raised, sort of epistemological issues. You know, what do you trust and what does it mean to develop knowledge on animals, and what do you do with that knowledge? So the clip I'm going to show you in a second is, of course, you know, it's part of David Attenborough's repertoire. It does show us something the bird is doing and how much value you attribute to the footage in order to counter the argument that Schneider-Adams poses. Then it's entirely up to you or up to us. So let's have a look at this footage and see what you make out of this.
He might lack the plumage, but he's got an extraordinary repertoire of song. And he's a wonderful mimic. Those are pigeon wing beats. That's a modest tiger parrot. And that, a sulphur-crested cockatoo. Even more surprising, he's an avid collector with a very appreciative eye for colour. This male favours red and orange flowers. And he's very fond of fungus. Not everything he collects stays where it should. He puts these treasures on display within and around a construction that has taken him years to build. A giant bower woven around a central sapling, carpeted with moss. This grand design is no nest, it's the ultimate seduction parlour. But he's not alone on this hillside. He's got 6 rivals within earshot. This one prefers darker colours, decorating his bower with deer dung. And charcoal. Visual effect is of crucial importance. Clearly, he hadn't planned on all this sprouting fungus. He and his nearest rival live a stone's throw apart. Competition is intense. It's the dung ball bower that is the first to catch the female's attention. He withdraws while she inspects his workmanship. She's back again and seems impressed. But on closer inspection, she's less convinced. Perhaps it was that sprouting fungus. Back at the flower bower, the male performs a dress rehearsal. He senses she's watching. This is the moment he's been working towards. His bower channels his song in her direction.
Imagine the end, right? And what's building up to. It's going to go well for this guy. But, most importantly, we all realize that, technically, David Attenborough could have just actually created, could have crafted this bowerbird out of nothing. He could have just built different footage. The barn could have been built by anyone, like an artist, right? And placed there. And the birds happen to do things around it. Splice the film correctly, add the narrative, music, and you have an animal that doesn't exist out there, right? Nevertheless, we know that there is an institutional ethical set by which David Attenborough operates, whereby his role within the natural history institution is to actually try to portray the events as realistically as possible. And that, of course, is where everything becomes very frail. This is still his perception of how things are effectively developing, of what is happening. Not necessarily just him. There are scientists with him, and it all depends on the kind of footage you have and you've managed to acquire. So, what we learn from here is quite interesting. But how much of it can be actually used for counter-argue what Schneider says is entirely open to question. Or is it? How important do you think in the claim, the claims that she made with regards to animals don't operate following aesthetic choices, or we just saw one doing so, but our knowledge is actually formed from footage that's being served to us. We know that's been very much mediated. do we stick to Adams and just say, you know, or is this enough evidence that animals are capable of different behaviors? Or do we need more? Let's have a look at the issues that are raised by this comparison between, you know, Adams is adamant that animals don't do what we've just seen here. So how does that statement come about? Without having to look hard into ethological accounts, Adams could have also found many examples of mammals who have picked up pencils and brushes to create compositions of lines and colors on paper and canvases. You have to look at the work of Desmond Morris, for instance, from the 50s, to have some examples. Preferring to ignore these examples, Adams' argument positions the animal as passive and oblivious to its environment, in opposition to the active and creative artist who keenly observes the environment, understands it, and is able to transform it into art, something that, in the Aristotelian view, improves nature. Aside from the many misconceptions proclaimed by Adams, what the author fails to recognize is that the spider's web has a practical material purpose, and that, as such, its comparison with the creation of a work of art, something that by definition serves no practical purpose, at least in its classical or more traditional inception, is structurally precarious. Adams' assertion that animals are genetically programmed and therefore incapable of making art reflects the essence of the widespread relational models we have established with them, modes driven by an overlay determined need to separate ourselves from them at all costs, even if that entails arguing the absurd and denying evidence. And again, we've seen what problems we have with evidence. Discounting the abilities of animals as programmed or unconscious is something ingrained in Western culture. To force specific human abilities onto animals in order to relentlessly produce skewed evidence of human superiority is typical of anthropocentric behaviors. Famously, in order to confirm animals' inferiority, Descartes argued that their behavior is instinctive, that they lack adaptability, and of course, language. Similarly, Heidegger's idea that animals are poor in world saw them lacking the ability to conceive of an object as something more than a functional entity, while men are seen as world-forming, and therefore capable of creating art out of what the animal clumsily simply makes. The year 2004 was also the one in which Agamben's The Open, Man and Animal was translated into English. Has anyone read that book, Agamben? No? It's quite interesting. Small book in which the philosopher reasons around ideas of animality. And again, this is part of the issue of how do we use knowledge created looking or referencing the live animal, or is that needed at all? So for instance, the book addresses the issue of human-animal divide and treats the subject as a defining argument in the contemporary philosophical debate. Agamben asks, quote, "What is man if he is always the place and at the same time the result of ceaseless divisions and seizures? It is more urgent to work on these divisions, to ask in what way, within man, has man been separated from non-man, and then animal from the human, than it is to take positions on the great issues on so-called human rights and values." Interestingly, halfway through The Open, we find the question of the spider and its web surfacing again. Now this idea of spiders, you probably already noticed that it's quite a recurrent one. Spiders are pretty special animals. How many of you like spiders? Oh, why do we like them?
I don't know. I think their legs are really cool, actually.
Anything in particular that makes them stand out as cool?
I don't know. They're really slender. Like I remember. I mean, it's not quite the same as like Spider, but there's I had a pet daddy long legs.
Oh right, yeah, big predators.
Yeah.
Well, they still weave webs and do things. Yeah. Any more on spiders?
They clean the apartment.
They clean the apartment, yeah. They're quite fascinating. Yeah, they have, have you come across those theories that claim that they might come from another planet? No? I have. Nevertheless, that's again, it's part of where do we look for evidence? Probably not in outer space. Let's stay within this planet. Nevertheless, spiders are special animals because like the Vogelkopf bowerbird, they do things with tools. And in that respect, a web is a little bit different from a tool. You're all aware of the big thing that separates us philosophically from animals is the fact that we can use tools, and therefore we embraced and invented technology, and animals cannot really do that. We know that some animals are actually very capable of using tools. But with a spider web, here's something quite complicated. One thing is building, another thing is using tools. And with the spider web, the spider web is created by the spinnerets of the spider. So it's almost like you could probably compare it to our saliva to a degree. It's something we make. But we don't use our saliva as a tool, do we? Unless you use your spitting to catch things, and very creative people with spitting. But the spider does. So there's a moment at which the spinneret detaches the wire. The thread is freed from the spider web, from the spider itself, and then the spider sits on the spider web and creates a different kind of connection with the spider web. That's when the spider web becomes a tool. It's detached from the body and it's used to catch things. And that triggers the minds of many philosophers who talk about spiders quite readily. For instance, this is one of the most interesting quotes. I don't know if you've come across this before, but there's a spider in Capital by Marx. And what we find is that according to Marx, a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, not the other way around, right? That the weaver came before the spider. Notice that? And the bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. Do we subscribe to this version? Do you think that's what happens? Is it a plausible distinction there between these animals and man? You okay with that? Do we know if a spider has an idea of what it's doing when it's making a web? Do you think the spider knows what the web is going to come out like? Or do they just go about it and suddenly they create this incredibly perfect structure that catches things and it's strong enough to withstand the elements, usually? Is it all kind of just like they do? See the point? Obviously, Adams gets this idea of the spider. That's why she returns to the spider, because I think at some point in her life she must have read this passage from Marx. And even if she doesn't quote Marx directly in her text, she thinks this is going to make me look smart, right? And this is going to basically really give me some credibility here. My argument is going to acquire some ground. And it really does the opposite, in my perspective anyway. That is part of the anthropocentric perspective. We assume that there's nothing really in the mind of the spider that has a blueprint of what this spider web is going to look like. But if you've noticed where you find spider webs is never in places where you think that web will not be a spider web there, right? Spider webs, build their spider webs in places where the spider web is going to work. Around lights, in corners where there is some access from the outside so that insects can actually get into it. They're not randomly at some point saying, you know what, I feel like spinning this now, I'm just going to do it in this corner and see what comes out. It's a matter of life or death, right? It's a different thing, but it's very difficult for us to actually get into the minds of these animals because it's impossible. But nevertheless, what we've done culturally is actually assuming that there's nothing there. And that's a clear statement, right? The difference between what we build and what the animals build is that there is a structure in imagination. We think it through beforehand and build accordingly. Do we always do that as artists? Sometimes it's about the process, right? And you make things as you go along, and material guides you in your creation as much as your imagined work. It doesn't always come out that way, right? You adjust your practice, your approach to the materials as you go along, as you discover things. Does that make you spider-like? Or bee-like? Maybe according to Marx, I think there's a more kind of spider-like approach to your work. Nevertheless, halfway through the open, we find the question of the spider and its web surfacing again. Agamben claims that the spider has no knowledge of the fly's size. That is the one statement, so we get one step further here. Not only the spider doesn't know what it's doing, according to Marx, the spider just weaves something that comes out. According to Agamben, the spider doesn't know the size of the fly. Which is a kind of interesting question, right? How does the spider know what the fly is like? The spider doesn't get a chance to go and measure it, right? The spider is weaving the web, hoping that something will be caught into it. But does the spider know what will be caught in the spider web or not? Interesting. So, the spider has no knowledge of the fly's size, but it is able to weave its web in such a way that the insect will be caught in it. He concludes that the world of the spider and that the one of the fly are uncommunicating and yet perfectly in tune, that we might say that the original score of the fly acts on that of the spider in such a way that the web the spider weaves can be described as fly-like. So according to Agamben, who's not a scientist, a philosopher, there is something that makes the spider web so perfect to catch the fly that he can call the spider web fly-like, even if he claims that the spider does not know what the fly is like and how to catch it. So it's a sort of random coincidence that makes nature works. And of course, at that we could have we could pose many questions of breeding. It's like, how does that fit with evolution, if that's what's going on? So spiders are just weaving stuff in one corner. It comes out all very messy because they haven't got an idea of what they're doing. But luckily enough, flies get stuck to it, and that's how spiders went through millennia, like that. Fascinating. So, according to Agamben, the spider web expresses the coincidence, he uses the word coincidence, of this reciprocal blindness. Spider doesn't know what it's doing, fly doesn't know what's going on. That's why you never see a fly trying to get free itself from a spider web, right? The fly just sits there. You're like, eh, that's interesting. And the open, which is the space between human and animal, is shaped by a functional rhizomatic unit between animal and animals and environments, and of course, us and animals. So it's all very random, it's all very coincidental, according to Agamben. So the philosopher's understanding of spider, web, and fly echoes Bataille's conceit of the animal as water in water, in which the animal is something indissolubly connected with everything else around it, and according to Van Oxel, is tangled in a web of captivations of which the animal has no awareness, in opposition to its thorough consciousness, the thorough consciousness that humans conceive in understanding and separating the world of humans from that of animals. Agamben's vision of the relationship is problematic, for it echoes Heidegger's idea that the animal has no ability to grasp its own essence. And as Ron Broglio rightly points out, to call the spider and fly relationship absolutely uncommunicating misses the shifts in species over time and limits what we call communication. In rereading Agamben, I have found myself asking which species of spider is the author referring to in his argument. Now, when you find that philosophers talk about animals, one of the main issues is that they will talk about the spider, the cow, the bird. What spider is that? What bird is that? And does that make any difference to a philosophical argument? What's the validity of a philosophical argument based on the spider? Have you seen the spider recently? What does the spider look like? How big is it? Like this? Like this? Seen like different spider webs? Some spiders create cones into crevices, others weave webs between trees. Which is the one that Agamben is saying, you know, catches flies by chance and the fly knows nothing, and it's really odd. But then again, a whole philosophical argument is woven around this idea. And we read it in books, and we develop ideas about spiders that are repeated and passed on, like the one that Marx puts on the Capital and Adams uses for her book. So you can see how it's the same idea, the same misconception is repeated over and over and over. So now I'm going to show you two spiders, again through the eyes of David Attenborough and his crew, so with those ideas in mind of how much this is not perhaps really the real behavior, but nevertheless it's better than a kick. And we'll see how this presents us something a little bit different from the spider.
But one North American spider
that Agamben
has
might be
just
thinking of.
a single filament. This may look like a bird dropping, but that's just a disguise to fool anything that might want to eat it. In fact, it's a spider, and one with an even more extraordinary hunting technique. It's a bolas spider. Throughout the day, she remains motionless, but when evening comes, she prepares for action. She abandons her disguise and starts to move. Slowly, she makes her way down to the underside of the leaf. There she hangs from a horizontal thread. Next, she starts to spin a single strong line, pulling it out of her spinneret with her back legs. And at the end, there is a sticky globule. This is her bolas. It's all she needs. She climbs back up to her leaf and takes up her position on the horizontal thread with her weighted filament dangling from one of her front legs. A moth. She whirls her bolas, but misses. But she has ways of enticing the moth back. She can produce a pheromone, a chemical perfume that the moth finds irresistible. What is more, she can change it to suit the particular species of moth that happens to be around. The moth comes back. This time, she's got it. Now she starts to wrap it. But she's not finished yet. Different moths and a different pheromone.
So that was the bolus spider. Quite fascinating. Now there's this chap here. This is the gladiator spider.
The gladiator spider makes her web from a very special kind of multi-strand silk which she backcombs to make fuzzy. She carefully attaches this to a framework of ordinary unfuzzy filaments. The fuzzy silk doesn't have glue on it, but it will entangle hairy legs. And it's also extremely elastic, which is crucially important. It's finished. She reaches down with her forelegs to check how far away she is from the ground. Then she snips most of the framework threads and holds the fuzzy rectangle between her 4 front legs. She's ready. Her enormous eyes are so sensitive she can hunt in near darkness. A bush cricket would make a rich meal, but it's very powerful and it could put up a good fight. Now it must be parcelled up, and the fuzzy silk makes excellent wrapping, just as it does for Hyptiotes.
Good. So that gives you a good idea of spiders that do something a little bit more imaginative, if you like, than just randomly weaving some silk in a corner just because they happen to be there, and then you know, a fly happens to get tangled into it. These are quite interesting spiders. So the issue here at stake really is, how does the behavior displayed by these spiders challenge Agamben's view? Are the contributions specific to the artistic sphere that may complement scientific truths and philosophical truths important? This is an area of contention. Which animals does philosophy speak of when it utters the word animal? A literary one, or an animal made of flesh and bone, or even one made of chitin? And what consequences may be involved in not distinguishing between the two? As discussed by Lyotard in the postmodern condition, science does not represent the totality of knowledge, and the post-Enlightenment prominence science has carved for itself in their understanding of natural phenomena may not suffice to understand the animal today. Not so much because its evidential validity can be brought into question, but because its suitability as a comprehensive approach to the capturing of the complexity of nature is open to reconsideration. Agamben's argument aims, however, at more than understanding the animal alone. He effectively attempts to discuss how human essence is defined against that of the animal, and how this affects human relationships. In Agamben's view, the human-animal dichotomy is created and perpetrated by the anthropological machine, the process of translating nature into culture, whose functioning in modern times through political, scientific, and ontological constructs, on the one hand looks for a connection between human and animal through scientific inquiry into evolution, and on the other adopts the construct of animality to render the human non-man. the Jew, in his example, in his book, that is the non-man produced within the man, or the neomorph, as he calls it in his book, and the overcomatose person, that is the animal, separated within the human body itself. It appears clear, following this line of thought, that the revisioning of our relationship with animals does not simply involve understanding animal life beyond its biological or ethological functioning, but also entails risking the human. The possibility of this risk was initiated by Bertrand Russell in 1913 when his famous theory of knowledge radically proposed a doubting of our understanding of knowledge in the light of the fact that the animal practices inference. What is of paramount importance to the urgency of the animal question is that now, more than ever before, finding new perspectives from which to understand life may radically change who we are, where we are going, and who we are going there with. For global warming, environmental decay, and mass extinction are all clear indications of the wrongness of our approaches. And that is all. Now I need to hear your questions and your thoughts on what we've seen so far. Yes?
I have a question about, like, it's like a technical question about
Sure.
spider webs. I was wondering if they are aware of the spider web being broken, so if they're aware of its functionality being altered, and if they reconstruct it.
Yes, that's very interesting you asked that question. There's a work of an artist called Nina Kachadurian, who years and years ago, I can't remember now if it was 92 or 93, did exactly that. So she went around the forest in which her summer house, her parents' summer house, was located, and looked for spider webs that were either damaged, broken, incomplete, and began mending them. So she would go around with thread, and actually very, very patiently with thread and tweezers would try to create a pattern to patch up the broken spider web. And she would revisit the spot the following day to see what had happened, and she would find all the time that the spider would actually gain control of the web and remove her patching and drop it to the floor. So she always would find her patching section on the ground right underneath the spider web, and the spider web mended by the spider itself. So I think it's beyond the kind of cuteness of the idea, you know, somebody going through the forest, I'm mending spider webs, thinking I'm going to help them or something. It does really show a level of awareness whereby the animal is refusing that interaction. It's just like, well, you know, this is not my thing, I don't know what it is, I'm removing it. Whether the spider understands what the intention was or not, the fact that it removes it as a foreign object and proceeds to patch up the original work, it's quite indicative of much more than a simple, I'm randomly doing things, which is what we like to believe, I think. Yes?
The quote that you gave for Marx about the imagining of constructions, if spiders and other animals do imagine their constructions ahead of time, I think that sort of it says that they can have, or that they have a notion of like time and past, present, future, at least future tense, if they're imagining this thing that they're going to make over there. And I'm wondering what you think about the implications of tenses of time then, if they can imagine their structures.
Well, one of the things that, it's a very interesting question. One of the concepts that von Oxkel worked on with the idea of Umwelt, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's basically part of his theory that dates back to the beginning of 1900 is that different animals perceive the world in very different ways from humans, and that's nothing new, but at the same time that this is actually, this can be pushed as far as understanding each species living in